The war didn't begin with swords. It began with a lie, and a boy who believed in honor. Everyone remembers Game of Thrones as a story of betrayal, blood, and broken oaths. But what if one choice had been different? What if one young king had not followed his heart, but his duty? What if Robb Stark had ended the Lannister rule? The wind howled through the camp that night, carrying with it the smell of rain and iron. Robb Stark stood alone outside his tent, staring into the distance where the fires of his army flickered like restless spirits. He was no longer just a boy from Winterfell. He was a king at war. But kings are often alone. Inside the camp, men whispered his name with respect, even fear. The young wolf, they called him. He had never lost a battle, not once. From the Whispering Wood to Oxcross, Robb Stark had outplayed seasoned commanders twice his age. Tywin Lannister himself had been forced to retreat, something few men in Westeros could ever claim. And yet, victory on the battlefield was not the same as victory in war, because war was not just fought with swords. It was fought with loyalty, promises, and sometimes betrayal. Robb knew this now. He clenched his fist as he remembered the letter in his hand earlier that day. News from King's Landing. His sisters were still captives. His father, executed like a criminal. Eddard Stark had died for honor. And Robb was beginning to understand that honor alone could not win this war. Behind him, the flap of his tent opened quietly. "My king," a soft voice said. Robb turned. It was Talisa. She stepped closer, her eyes searching his face the way only she could like. She saw through the armor, through the crown, straight to the boy underneath. "You haven't slept," she said gently. "There's too much to think about," Robb replied. Talisa moved beside him, looking out at the dark horizon. "You're afraid." Robb let out a faint breath, almost a laugh. "A king shouldn't be afraid." "No," she said, "but a man should be." For a moment, he said nothing. "I'm not afraid of losing," Robb finally admitted. "I'm afraid of what it will cost to win." Talisa didn't answer right away. She knew what he meant. Every victory had already cost him something. Men, trust, pieces of himself, and the worst cost was still coming. Far away in the Twins, Walder Frey waited, and Robb Stark had already made the mistake that would change everything. Or at least, that's how the story was supposed to go. But this is not that story, because in this version, Robb Stark does something different, something small, but powerful, something that saves him. Earlier that same evening, before Talisa came to him, Robb had sat with his mother, Catelyn Stark, inside the tent. The fire between them crackled softly, but the air was heavy. "You made a promise to Walder Frey," Catelyn said, her voice calm but firm. "And you broke it." Robb looked away. "I married for love, and you may have doomed us for it." The words stung, but Robb didn't argue, because deep down he knew she was right. House Frey was not strong, not noble, not respected, but they were necessary. And in war, necessity mattered more than pride. "What would you have me do?" Robb asked quietly. Catelyn leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "Fix it, before it's too late." Robb frowned. "You think Walder Frey would forgive this?" "No," she said, "but he might pretend to if it benefits him." Robb thought about that. Walder Frey was not a man of honor. He was a man of advantage, which meant he could be played. That realization changed something in Robb. For the first time since the war began, he stopped thinking like Ned Stark's son and started thinking like a king. That night, Robb called for his most trusted advisors, Roose Bolton, the Blackfish, and a handful of loyal bannermen. The mood in the tent was tense. "You all know why we're here," Robb began. "I've made a mistake." No one spoke, but they all knew. "I broke my oath to House Frey," he continued, "and now we need to decide what happens next." Roose Bolton's pale eyes watched him carefully. "Walder Frey will demand compensation. He'll demand more than that," the Blackfish said. "He'll demand blood, if he thinks he can get away with it." Robb nodded slowly. "And that's exactly why we weren't given the chance." The room fell silent. "What do you mean?" one lord asked. Robb stepped forward, his voice steady now. "We will still go to the Twins," he said. "We will still apologize. We will still offer terms." "And then?" Roose asked. Robb's eyes hardened. "And then?" Roose asked. Robb's eyes hardened. "And then we watch." He looked around the room. Every man, every door, every movement. We treat that castle like enemy ground, because that's exactly what it is. The Blackfish's lips curled slightly, almost a smile. Now you're thinking like a Tully. Roose Bolton tilted his head. You suspect treachery. I expect it, Robb replied. That one sentence changed everything, because in the story everyone knows Robb Stark walked into the twins blind, but in this story, everyone knows Robb Stark walked into the twins blind. But in this story, he walks in with his eyes wide open, and that means the Red Wedding will not happen the way it was meant to. Outside, the storm finally broke. Rain poured down over the camp, washing away the dust and blood of war for now. But storms don't end wars. They only prepare the ground for what comes next. Robb Stark stood at the entrance of his tent, watching the rain fall. I will win this war, he said quietly, not for revenge, not for glory, but to end the Lannisters once and for all. And this time, he meant it. The road to the twins was quieter than it should have been. That alone made Robb Stark uneasy. Armies marching to a wedding should not feel like they were walking toward a battlefield. But every instinct in him screamed that something was wrong. The riverlands stretched out around them, damp and grey, the sky heavy with clouds that never seemed to break. Robb rode at the front, his direwolf Greywind pacing beside his horse, unusually alert. The animal's ears twitched at every sound, every movement in the distance. Animals didn't lie. And Greywind sensed danger. Behind Robb, banners of the north swayed in the wind. Men laughed, drank, and spoke of food and celebration waiting at the twins. They believed this was a moment of peace, a pause in the war, but Robb didn't believe in peace anymore. Not here, not now. He slowed his horse slightly, allowing Catelyn Stark to ride beside him. You feel it too, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Robb nodded. Something's wrong. Catelyn glanced ahead at the distant towers of the twins, barely visible through the mist. Walder Frey is not a forgiving man. No, Robb said, but he's predictable. She looked at him, surprised. Is he? Yes, Robb replied. He values advantage above all else. If he's planning something, it's because he believes he'll win. And you intend to prove him wrong? Robb didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked back at his army, at the men who trusted him, who followed him, who would die for him. They intend to survive, he said. That night, they made camp just a few miles from the twins. But unlike every other night, Robb gave different orders. No loud fires, no drunken singing, double guards at every perimeter. And most importantly, no one was to enter the twins unarmed. They'll see that as an insult, one lord warned. Good, Robb said. Let them. Inside his command tent, the atmosphere was tight, almost suffocating. The Blackfish stood over a rough map of the twins, marking entrances and exits. Roose Bolton lingered in the shadows, silent as always, his pale eyes watching everything. We split the men, Robb instructed. Half will enter for the feast, the rest stay outside, ready. That's not how guest ride works, one bannerman protested. Robb turned sharply, and breaking oaths isn't how alliances work. Yet here we are. No one argued after that. Even Roose Bolton gave a slight nod, though his expression remained unreadable. You've changed, Your Grace, Roose said softly. Robb met his gaze. I had to, but in truth, he didn't know if that was a good thing, because every step away from honor felt like a step away from the man his father raised him to be, and yet his father was dead, because he trusted the wrong people. Robb would not make the same mistake. As the night deepened, Talisa found him again. You're preparing for a battle, she said, noticing the tension in his movements. Robb gave a faint smile. I'm preparing for a wedding. Talisa stepped closer, lowering her voice. You think they'll try to kill you. It wasn't fear in her voice. It was certainty. Robb hesitated, then nodded. Yes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Talisa reached for his hand. Then don't go. Robb looked at her, surprised. If you know it's a trap, she continued, why walk into it? Because if I don't, Robb said, I lose the phrase completely. And if I lose them, I lose this war. Talisa's grip tightened. And if you go, you might lose your life. Robb held her gaze. If I die, he said quietly, then everything we fought for dies with me. The truth of that hung heavy between them. Talisa looked away first. "I didn't marry a king," she whispered. "I married a man." Robb stepped closer, gently lifting her chin so she would look at him again. "And that man is trying to protect you," he said. But even as he said it, he wasn't sure if it was true, because kings didn't always protect the people they loved. Sometimes they sacrificed them. The next morning, the twins stood before them in full view, two massive towers, connected by a narrow bridge over the river. Grey stone, cold and unwelcoming. It looked less like a place of celebration and more like a fortress waiting to swallow them whole. At the gates, Walder Frey's men waited, watching, measuring, judging. Robb dismounted slowly, his expression calm, controlled. But inside, every sense was sharp. Every movement mattered now. "Remember," he said quietly to the blackfish. Eyes open. The blackfish gave a grim smile. "Always." As they approached, the gates creaked open, and there he was. Walder Frey stood at the entrance, leaning on his cane, his thin lips curled into something that might have been a smile, or might have been something far worse. "King in the north," Walder said, his voice dry as old bones. "You kept me waiting." Robb bowed his head slightly. "I came as quickly as I could." Walder's eyes flicked to Talisa. "Ah," he said, "and this must be the reason for your delay." The insult hung in the air. But Robb didn't react, not the way he once would have. Instead, he stepped forward calmly. "I've come to apologize," Robb said, "and to make things right." Walder studied him for a long moment, then slowly he smiled. "Good," he said, "because I do so love a wedding." Behind Robb whined Robb. Grey Wind let out a low growl, soft but unmistakable, and for just a second, Walder Frey's smile faltered. It was small, almost invisible, but Robb saw it. And in that moment, he knew. This was not a celebration. This was a trap. But this time, the wolf had seen the teeth before they closed. The doors of the twins closed behind them with a heavy echoing thud. It sounded final, like something sealing shut. Robb Stark didn't turn around, but he felt it. That deep instinct again. The same one that had followed him all the way here. You are walking into a cage. The great hall was already alive with noise. Music played loudly, too loudly, as if it was trying to drown out something else. Servants rushed between tables, pouring wine, placing food, avoiding eye contact. That was the first sign. They wouldn't look at him. Robb walked forward slowly, his boots echoing against the stone floor. Around him, his men spread out, not casually, but carefully, each one alert, each one watching, just as he ordered. At the high table, Walder Frey sat like a spider in the center of its web, his many sons and daughters surrounding him. His expression was warm, but his eyes were not. "Welcome," Walder called out, raising a cup. "Let the wine flow. Tonight we celebrate unity." The hall cheered, but it didn't feel real. Robb took his seat, Talisa beside him, Catelyn nearby. Across the room, he spotted men he didn't recognize. Not Frey's, not his own. Bolton men, more than there should have been. His eyes shifted slightly and found Roose Bolton standing quietly near one of the pillars, watching everything. Too calm, too still. Something cold moved through Robb's chest. This wasn't just Frey. This was bigger. "Eat, my king," Walder said, gesturing to the table. "You look thin. War doesn't suit you." Robb forced a small smile. "War suits no one." Walder chuckled. "Ah, but some men are better at it than others." The words lingered. Robb reached for his cup, then stopped. For just a second, he remembered something his father once told him. When you don't trust the room, don't trust the wine. Instead, Robb set the cup down, untouched, and he wasn't the only one. The blackfish noticed. So did a few others. Small things. But in moments like this, small things meant everything. The music grew louder. Drums now. Faster. Heavier. Almost like a heartbeat. Robb leaned slightly toward Catelyn. "Do you hear that?" She nodded. She nodded. She nodded. "Too controlled," Robb added. Across the hall, a group of Frey soldiers shifted positions near the doors, blocking them. Not guarding them, blocking. That's when Robb knew. They all knew. He leaned back in his chair, his expression calm, but his voice, when he spoke, was low and sharp. "Be ready." Catelyn's hand tightened slightly around the edge of the table. Talisa looked at him, confused. "Robb, stay close to me," he said quietly. Then the music stopped, not faded, stopped, like a blade cutting through sound. For a split second, the hall was silent, and in that silence, Robb Stark moved first. "Now," he roared. The word hit like thunder. Before the first crossbow bolt could even fire, Robb flipped the table in front of him, sending plates, goblets, and food crashing to the ground. "Hesides!" the Blackfish shouted, and chaos exploded. Bolts flew, but instead of catching them off guard, many struck wood, tables, armor. Men were ready. Steel rang out as swords were drawn. Northern soldiers surged to their feet, slamming into Frey guards before they could form ranks. Screams filled the hall. But this time, they weren't just Stark screams. Walder Frey's face twisted in shock. "You," he began. But Robb was already moving, fast, focused, alive. Grey Wing's roar echoed from outside, savage and wild, as the direwolf tore into anyone who tried to reinforce the hall. Inside, Robb cut down the first man who came for him, his blade moving with deadly precision. This wasn't panic. This was preparation. "You knew!" Walder shouted, rising from his seat. Robb didn't answer, because there was nothing to say. Instead, he advanced, step by step, through the chaos, through the blood, toward the old man who thought he was the hunter. Roose Bolton moved, then slowly stepping forward, his hand resting on his sword. Their eyes met. For a moment, everything else seemed to fade. "You groan," Roose said calmly. Robb's grip tightened on his blade. "Not enough to trust you." Roose's lips twitched slightly. "Wise," he said. Then he stepped back, not forward, not attacking, backing the way, watching, waiting. And in that moment, Robb understood something terrifying. Roose Bolton wasn't here to fight. He was here to see who won, which meant he would betray whoever lost. "Coward," Robb muttered. But there was no time to deal with him. Not yet. A Frey soldier lunged at Robb from the side. Robb turned, parried, and drove his sword to the man's chest in one clean motion. Around him his men were holding, barely, but holding, because they were ready, but holding, because they were ready, because he was ready. Catelyn grabbed Talisa, pulling her behind an overturned bench as bolts continued to strike the walls and wood around them. "This isn't how it was supposed to happen," Catelyn whispered, almost to herself. And she was right. This wasn't the story everyone knew. Because in the story everyone knew, this was where the Starks died. But not today. Today, the wolf had teeth, and it was biting back. Robb reached the base of the high table, staring up at Walder Frey, whose confidence had completely shattered. "You should have stayed loyal," Robb said, his voice cold. Walder's hands trembled. "You broke your oath first, and you guessed right," Robb replied. A beat of silence. "Then that's worse." And with that, Robb Stark stepped forward into legend. Walder Frey stumbled backward, his thin hands gripping the edge of the table as if it could save him. It couldn't. The hall was no longer his. It belonged to chaos, to steel, to the wolf. Robb Stark climbed the steps slowly, deliberately, his boots slick with blood. Around him, the clash of swords echoed like thunder, trapped inside stone walls. Men screamed, begged, fought, but none of it reached him now, because in this moment, there was only one target. "You were supposed to die here," Walder Frey rasped, his voice shaking. "All of you." Robb stopped a few steps below him. "And you were supposed to be my ally," Robb replied. Walder's face twisted. "Alliances change." Robb nodded slowly. "So do kings." Behind him, a Frey guard rushed forward, but before he could reach Robb, a blade cut him down from the side. The Blackfish stepped into view, blood on his sword, his expression hard. "No interruptions," he muttered. Robb didn't even look back. His eyes never left Walder. "You chose this," Robb said. Walder's breathing quickened. His confidence, his arrogance, was gone now, replaced by something raw and desperate. "Wait," Walder said suddenly. "We can still fix this. Gold, men, the crossing, it's yours." Robb tilted his head slightly. For a second, it almost looked like he was considering it, and maybe once upon a time he would have. But that boy died with his father. You had your chance, Robb said quietly. Then he raised his sword and ended it. The blade fell clean, final. And just like that, House Frey lost its head. For a moment, the entire hall seemed to freeze. Even the fighting slowed, because everyone felt it. Something had shifted. This wasn't a failed trap anymore. This was a takeover. The king is dead. Someone shouted. No, the Blackfish barked. The wrong king is dead. And suddenly the north surged forward. What had been a desperate defense became a brutal counterattack. Frey soldiers, confused and leaderless, began to falter. Some tried to flee. Others dropped their weapons entirely. Outside, the sound of battle grew louder. Robb turned sharply. The gates. The Blackfish nodded. I'll handle it. He didn't wait for orders. He moved, cutting his way through the hall toward the entrance, rallying northern men as he went. Robb wiped his blade clean, his breathing steady, but his mind racing. This wasn't over, not even close, because Walder Frey had never been the true enemy. This had Lannister written all over it, and Bolton. Robb turned, scanning the room, looking for him. But Roose Bolton was gone, slipped away, like a shadow retreating from the light. Robb's jaw tightened. Of course, he muttered. Bolton had seen the tide turn and chosen survival over loyalty, which meant only one thing. He's running, Robb said. Catelyn stepped closer, her face pale but steady. Then let him run. No, Robb said firmly. If he reaches Tywin Lannister, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. They both understood. This war would only get worse. Talisa approached slowly, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes locked on Robb. You're alive, she whispered. Robb looked at her, really looked at her, and for just a moment, the king disappeared. He stepped forward, pulling her into a tight embrace. I told you I would be, he said softly. But his voice carried something new now, not just relief, resolve, because surviving this changed everything. It meant he wasn't just reacting anymore, he was ahead, and for the first time in this war, the Lannisters were not in control. Outside, the gates of the twins burst open. The Blackfish and his men secured the bridge, cutting down fleeing Frey guards and opening the path for the rest of the northern army to enter. The trap had been turned inside out. What was meant to be a slaughter had become a conquest. By nightfall, the twins belonged to Robb Stark. Bodies lined the halls, blood stained the stone. The music had long since stopped. Only silence remained, heavy, earned. Robb stood on the bridge between the two towers, staring out over the river below. The water moved calmly, as if nothing had happened, as if history hadn't just changed. Behind him, footsteps approached. Catelyn. It's done, she said quietly. Robb nodded, but he didn't look relieved. If anything, he looked more burdened. This was just the beginning, he said. Catelyn studied him. You've won a great victory. No, Robb replied. I've survived a trap. He turned to face her. Tywin Lannister sent them, he continued. Maybe not directly, but this was his kind of war. Catelyn didn't argue, because she knew it was true. Tywin didn't fight battles. He ended them with gold, with betrayal, with fear. And now, Robb said, he knows it failed. A cold wind passed between them. So what happens next? She asked. Robb looked back toward the horizon, toward the south, toward King's Landing, toward the south, toward King's Landing. Now, he said slowly, we take the war to him. That was the moment everything changed, because until now, Robb Stark had been fighting to survive, to protect, to respond, but not anymore. Now, he was coming for the throne, and in King's Landing, far from the blood of the twins, Tywin Lannister sat quietly in the Red Keep, reading reports by candlelight. A servant entered, nervous. My lord, a message from the twins. Tywin didn't look up. Read it. The servant hesitated. Then, my lord, House Frey has fallen. Robb Stark lives. Silence. Long. Heavy. Then slowly, Tywin Lannister looked up. And for the first time in a long time, there was something unfamiliar in his eyes. Not anger, not frustration, but something far more dangerous. The news spread faster than wildfire, from the riverlands to the north, from small villages to great castles. People whispered the same words with disbelief. The Red Wedding failed. Not just failed, destroyed. And at the center of it all stood one name, Robb Stark, the young wolf, had not been slaughtered. He had turned the slaughter around, and now the game had changed. In the halls of the Red Keep, silence lingered long after the message had been read. Tywin Lannister stood by the window, his hands resting behind his back, his posture as rigid as ever, but his mind was racing. "Walder Frey is dead," he said slowly, more to himself than anyone else. "Yes, my lord," the messenger replied nervously. "And Bolton?" "Missing." Tywin's jaw tightened slightly. "Of course he is. Roose Bolton was not a man who died easily. Bolton was not a man who died easily. He was a man who adapted, which meant he was still dangerous." Tywin turned, his sharp eyes locking onto the messenger. "How many men did Stark lose?" The messenger swallowed. "Fewer than expected, my lord." "Fewer than expected, my lord." He was prepared. That word echoed in the room. Prepared. Tywin walked slowly back to the table, placing both hands on its surface. "That is the problem," he said quietly. "Because Robb Stark was not supposed to be prepared. He was supposed to be predictable, honorable, naive. But now, he was none of those things. And that made him far more dangerous than any army. Meanwhile, at the Twins, the banners had changed. Where once the sigil of House Frey hung proudly, now the direwolf of House Stark ruled the towers. Robb stood in the great hall, the same hall that had nearly become his grave, now completely under his control. The bodies were gone, the blood cleaned, but the memory still lingered. "This place will never feel clean," Talisa said softly, standing beside him. Robb didn't look at her. "It's not supposed to," he replied. She studied him carefully. "You've changed," she said. Robb exhaled slowly. "I had to." Talisa stepped closer. "And how much more will you have to change before this war is over?" That question hit deeper than any blade, but Robb didn't answer it, because he didn't have one. Instead, he turned away. "There's no time for that now," he said. "We move south." Talisa frowned. "So soon?" "Yes." Robb's voice was firm. "Tywin will already be planning his next move. If we give him time, we lose the advantage." "And if you don't?" she asked. Robb finally looked at her. "Then we end this." That night, his war council gathered once again. But this time, the tone was different. They weren't discussing survival. They were discussing conquest. "We hold the Twins," the Blackfish said, pointing to the map. "That gives us control of the crossing. It cuts off Lannister movement. And it gives us leverage," another lord added. Robb nodded, but it's not enough. He stepped forward, placing his hand firmly on the map. "We need to strike where it hurts." His finger moved south, to one place, King's Landing. The room went quiet. "That's suicide," one bannerman said. "Not if we do it right," Robb replied. "You're talking about attacking the capital," another said. "The strongest city in the Seven Kingdoms, and the most vulnerable," Robb countered. They looked at him, confused. Robb's eyes sharpened. "Tywin Lannister is not there," he explained. "His forces are scattered. The city relies on the crown's defenses and fear." The Blackfish leaned in slightly. "You're saying we don't siege it," he said. "We take it," Robb replied. The words hung in the air. Bold, dangerous, almost impossible, but not impossible enough. "And what about the Baratheons?" someone asked. "Stannis, Renly's men divided," Robb cut in, "fighting each other." He straightened. "That's why we move now." For the first time, they weren't reacting to the war. They were shaping it. Far to the south, in King's Landing, the tension had already begun to spread. Cersei Lannister paced back and forth in the throne room, her face tight with anger. "This is your fault," she snapped. Tyrion Lannister raised an eyebrow. "My fault? That's impressive, even for you. You said the Northerners were predictable." "They were," Tyrion replied calmly. "Until they weren't." Cersei stopped, glaring at him. "He's marching south," she said. "Do you understand what that means?" Tyrion took a slow sip of wine. "It means," he said, "we finally have a real problem. Because Robb Stark was no longer just a rebellious boy king. He was a survivor, a strategist, and now a threat to the throne itself." Back at the Twins, Robb stood alone once more, looking out over the river. The same place where everything had nearly ended. Now, it was where everything began. Footsteps approached behind him. "Catelyn, you're thinking about him," she said. Robb didn't need to ask who. Ned Stark, she added softly. Robb nodded. He would have done things differently. Yes, Catelyn said. A pause. But he wouldn't be here. That truth settled heavily between them. Robb looked down at his hands. Hands that had killed. Hands that had chosen survival over honor. Do you think he'd be ashamed of me? Robb asked quietly. Catelyn stepped beside him. No, she said. She placed a hand on his arm. I think he'd be proud that you're still alive. Robb closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. Stronger, colder, more certain. Good, he said, because what he was about to do next would change everything. He turned, his voice carrying across the bridge. Send word to every banner, he commanded. We march on King's Landing, and far away in the capital, the lion was waiting. But this time, the wolf was coming for its throat. War is not won when you decide to fight. It is won when your enemy realizes too late that they are already losing. And by the time Robb Stark's army began its march south, that realization had already started to creep into the bones of Westeros. The roads told the story first. Villages that once feared Lannister soldiers now whispered of the wolf. Not with fear, but with something unfamiliar. Hope. Small folk gathered as the northern army passed. They didn't cheer loudly. They weren't foolish, but they watched, quietly, carefully, because they remembered what Lannister rule felt like. Burned fields, empty grain stores, soldiers who took what they wanted and left nothing behind. And now, for the first time, those same people looked at Robb Stark and wondered, could this boy actually end it? Robb rode at the front, but he noticed everything. The way people stepped out of their homes, the way they stared at his banners, the way some even bowed quickly, nervously, like they weren't sure if it was safe to believe again. That kind of loyalty was more powerful than any sword, but it was also fragile, and Robb knew if he failed, it would break completely. Easty, the same river where Robert Baratheon had once won a crown with a hammer and fury. History lingered in places like this, and Robb could feel it. You're thinking too much again, Talisa said as she approached him, wrapping a cloak tighter around herself against the cold wind. Robb gave a faint smile. That's kind of required when you're trying to take a kingdom. She stepped beside him, looking out at the river. And what happens when you do? She asked. Robb didn't answer immediately, because for the first time, he allowed himself to think about it. Not just winning the war, but what came after. No more war, he said finally. No more burning villages. No more children growing up afraid of soldiers. Talisa studied him. You really believe you can change all of that? Robb looked at her, not as a king, not as a commander, but as a man who had seen too much too young. I have to, he said, and for a moment she believed him completely. But war didn't care about belief. War cared about power. And in King's Landing, power was gathering. Inside the Red Keep, the atmosphere had shifted. Not panic, not yet, but tension, sharp and growing. Tyrion Lannister stood over a large map of the Crown Lands, small carved figures marking armies and movements. His eyes moved quickly, calculating, adjusting. He's not marching like a boy, Tyrion muttered. Across the room, Cersei Lannister watched him impatiently. He's marching like a threat, she said. That's all that matters. Tyrion shook his head. No, there's a difference. A boy charges. A threat plans. He moved one of the pieces. Robb Stark is not heading straight for us. Cersei frowned. What do you mean? He's cutting supply lines, Tyrion explained. Taking smaller castles, securing roads. He looked up. He's isolating King's Landing. That realization hung heavy, because it meant one thing. This wasn't a reckless attack. This was a siege. Before the siege. And that made it far more dangerous. Where is father? Cersei demanded. Still in the west, Tyrion replied. Gathering forces. Cersei's voice sharpened. Then he needs to return. Now. Tyrion didn't respond immediately, because deep down he wasn't sure Tywin would make it in time. Back in the northern camp, another conversation was unfolding, far more dangerous. In the shadows of the tents, a lone rider arrived, quiet, unnoticed by most, but not by Robb. Bring him in, Robb ordered. The man was hooded, his face hidden until he stepped into the firelight. And when he did, Catelyn froze. "You," she whispered, because she recognized him. Roose Bolton, alive, calm, and somehow still confident. Robb didn't draw his sword, but his voice was cold. "You ran." Roose inclined his head slightly. "I survived." "That's not the same thing," Robb replied. "No," Roose said softly, "but it's often more useful." The tension in the tent tightened like a drawn bowstring. "Why are you here?" Catelyn demanded. Roose's pale eyes shifted between them. "To offer you something," he said. Robb's grip on the table tightened. "I don't trust you." Roose gave a faint, almost amused expression. "You shouldn't." A pause. Then, "But you should listen." That was the dangerous part, because men like Roose Bolton were never more useful than when they were being honest. "Speak," Robb said. Roose stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Tywin Lannister is moving north," he said. "Not to attack you, but to cut you off." Robb's expression didn't change, but inside, everything sharpened. "If he takes the Riverlands behind you," Roose continued, "your army becomes trapped. No supplies, no retreat." Catelyn frowned. "Why tell us this?" Roose's answer came without hesitation. "Because if you lose, I lose." That was the truth. Cold, simple, self-serving, and completely believable. Robb studied him carefully. "You betrayed me once," Robb said. Roose shook his head slightly. "I chose the winning side," he corrected. Then his eyes locked onto Robb's. "And now, I'm here to see if that's still you." Silence filled the tent, heavy, uncomfortable, real. Because this was the kind of choice kings had to make. Trust a traitor or risk losing everything. Robb exhaled slowly. Then he stepped forward, not as a boy, not as Ned Stark's son, but as something new. "If you betray me again," Robb said quietly, "I won't kill you." Rose's brow lifted slightly. "I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what you are," Robb continued, "and no one in Westeros will ever trust you again." That landed, because for a man like Roose Bolton, reputation was power, and losing it was worse than death. For the first time, Roose actually smiled, a thin, dangerous smile. "Then I suppose," he said, "I'll have to stay loyal." Robb didn't return the smile, because he knew better, but he had just done something important. He hadn't trusted Roose. He had controlled him, and that was the difference between a boy king and a ruler who could end dynasties. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the distant smell of rain. Another storm was coming, but this time, Robb Stark wasn't walking into it blindly. He was walking straight through it, toward King's Landing. Toward King's Landing. Toward the Lion. Toward the end of Lannister rule. By the time Robb Stark's army reached the outer Crown Lands, the war had already begun inside King's Landing. Not with swords. With fear. Food had started to run low, not completely, but enough for people to notice. Bread lines stretched longer each day. Prices rose quietly. Then suddenly, whispers spread faster than truth ever could. The wolf is coming, and fear, once planted, grows on its own. Robb didn't rush. That was the part no one expected. Any other king, young, hungry, desperate, would have charged straight for the gates, hoping to break the city before reinforcements arrived. But Robb Stark had learned. War was not about speed. It was about pressure, slow, relentless, unavoidable. His army moved like a tightening grip around King's Landing, cutting roads, intercepting supply wagons, taking control of nearby strongholds one by one. Ravens stopped flying in and out. Messengers disappeared. The city wasn't under attack. It was being suffocated. Inside the Red Keep, the tension had finally turned into something sharper. Tyrion Lannister stood on the walls, looking out over the distant hills where Stark banners could now be seen. Not close enough to strike, but close enough to remind everyone they were there. "He's not going to attack," Tyrion said quietly. Beside him, Cersei Lannister frowned. "That makes no sense." "It makes perfect sense," Tyrion replied. "He doesn't need to break the city." He gestured toward the streets below. "The city will break itself." And that was already beginning. Riots had started in Flea Bottom. Small at first, fights over food, over coin, over nothing at all. But those small cracks were spreading, because hunger doesn't stay quiet for long. Cersei's voice lowered. "Where is father?" Tyrion didn't answer right away, because the truth was simple. Tywin Lannister was still too far away, and for the first time, that mattered. Outside the city, Robb Stark stood on a hill overlooking King's Landing, the capital, the seat of power, the place where his father had been executed like a traitor. He stared at the walls for a long time, saying nothing. Talisa stood beside him. "This is it," she said softly. Robb nodded, but there was no excitement in his face, no satisfaction, only weight. "Do you ever think about what happens after this?" Talisa asked. Robb glanced at her. "After you win?" That word again, win. It sounded simple, too simple. "There's no clean ending to this," Robb said. "Even if I take the city, even if I take the throne." He looked back at the walls. "Someone else will come for it one day." Talisa studied him carefully. "And what makes you different?" Robb didn't answer immediately, because that question was the real war. Finally, he spoke. "I remember what it feels like to lose everything," he said. "Most kings don't." That was the truth, and it made him dangerous. Behind them, footsteps approached. The Blackfish. "It's working," he said. "Riots inside the city. Our scouts confirm it." Robb nodded. "And Tywin?" "Still marching," the Blackfish replied. "But he's days away." Days, that was all they had. Robb took a slow breath. "Then we end it before he arrives." Then we end it before he arrives. That decision would decide everything. That night, under the cover of darkness, the plan began. Not a full assault. Not yet. Something quieter, smarter. Small groups of northern soldiers moved through hidden paths, guided by locals who knew the land better than any map. Old tunnels, forgotten routes, weak points in the outer defenses. At the same time, inside the city, chaos grew, and chaos is the best weapon in war. By dawn, King's Landing was already unraveling. Smoke rose from parts of the city. Bells rang, not in celebration, but in warning. Guards were stretched thin, trying to control crowds instead of preparing for battle. And that's when Robb struck. Not with everything, just enough. A single gate on the eastern side was attacked. Hard, fast, loud. The defenders rushed to it, pulling forces from other sections of the wall. Exactly as planned. Because the real attack was somewhere else, through a lesser guarded passage opened from the inside by men who had already slipped into the city during the night. The gates didn't fall, they opened, and the north poured in, street by street, not like invaders, like a force that had already decided the outcome. Robb rode in with them, his sword drawn, his expression focused but calm. This wasn't rage, this wasn't revenge, this was control. Lannister soldiers tried to regroup, but they were scattered, confused, already weakened by days of tension and unrest. And then the gold cloaks broke. Some ran, some surrendered, some disappeared into the chaos, because they no longer believed the Lannisters would protect them. And belief is what holds a city together. Inside the Red Keep, the truth finally arrived. There, inside the city, a guard shouted. Cersei froze. "No," she said. "That's not possible." But it was. Tyrion didn't panic. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again. Calm, focused. "He didn't attack the city," Tyrion said quietly. "He took it. That was the difference. And that difference was everything." Back in the streets, Robb Stark rode forward as people moved out of his way. Not screaming, not resisting, just watching. Because deep down they already knew the lion had lost, and the wolf had come for the throne. King's Landing didn't fall in a single moment. It collapsed, piece by piece, like a lie that had been told for too long. By midday, the streets were no longer under Lannister control. The gold cloaks had either thrown down their weapons or vanished into the chaos. The people, once silent, once afraid, now watched everything unfold with cautious eyes. No cheers, no celebrations, just quiet, waiting, because they had seen rulers come and go, and they had learned one truth: power changes hands, but suffering often stays the same. Robb Stark rode through the city slowly, his men forming a controlled line behind him. No looting, no burning, no chaos. That was his order, and for the first time in a long time, an army followed discipline instead of destruction. Still, the weight of the city pressed down on him. Every street carried memory. Every corner whispered something darker. This was where his father had died. not in battle, but in chains. Robb stopped his horse near the steps of the Great Sept, staring at the place where Eddard Stark had been executed. For a moment, the king disappeared, and only the sun remained. Talisa approached quietly, her voice soft. "You don't have to do this alone." Robb didn't look at her. "I'm not alone," he said, but it didn't sound convincing, because some things no army could stand beside you for. He dismounted slowly, his boots touching the same ground where his father's blood had once fallen, and for a second everything went silent. No war, no throne, no victory, just memory. "I couldn't save you," Robb whispered under his breath, "but I can finish it." That was the difference. This wasn't revenge anymore, it was closure. Behind him the gates of the Red Keep stood open, unprotected, waiting. Inside, the last pieces of Lannister rule were already breaking. Cersei Lannister stood in the throne room, her face pale but her posture still proud. Even now she refused to look defeated. "They will kill us," she said coldly. Across from her, Tyrion Lannister shook his head. "No," he said, "he won't." Cersei laughed bitterly. "You think the boy who lost his father will show mercy?" Tyrion met her gaze. "I think the man who survived this war might." Footsteps echoed through the hall, slow, measured, and then Robb Stark entered, not as a boy, not as a grieving son, but as a king who had crossed fire and betrayal and come out harder, stronger, real. His eyes moved across the room and stopped on them. The lions, the family that had started it all. For a moment, no one spoke, because this was bigger than words. Finally, Cersei stepped forward. "If you're going to kill me," she said, her voice steady, "do it quickly." Robb studied her, really studied her, not as an enemy, but as a piece of the war. "You think this ends with your death?" Robb asked quietly. Cersei didn't answer, because she didn't know, and that was new. Robb stepped closer. "If I kill you," he continued, "you become a martyr to your name. Another reason for war." His voice hardened slightly. "I'm not here to continue this." Tyrion watched him carefully. "You're here to end it," Tyrion said. Robb's eyes shifted to him. Yes, that one word changed everything, because ending a war was harder than winning one. It required something most rulers didn't have: control. Robb turned slightly, addressing both of them now. "House Lannister is finished," he said. "Not in blood, but in power." Cersei's jaw tightened. "You think taking this throne makes you king?" Robb looked at the Iron Throne behind her. Cold, ugly, sharp, built on conquest. "I don't want that throne," he said. "That shocks them, both of them, because no one says that. No one wins and walks away from power. But Robb Stark wasn't like the others. The North will be free," he continued. "Independent, no more Southern rule." He paused, "and the rest of the kingdoms will choose their own rulers." Tyrion blinked slightly, realizing what that meant. "You're breaking the wheel," he said quietly. Realizing what that meant. "You're breaking the wheel," he said quietly. Robb didn't smile. "I'm stopping it from crushing people." That was the difference, and that difference was why he won. Outside, word began to spread quickly. The war was over. Not with fire, not with massacre, but with a decision. And slowly, the city exhaled. For the first time in years, there was no fighting, no screaming, no fear hanging in the air, just silence, real silence. That night, Robb stood alone in the throne room. The Iron Throne stood before him. He could take it, sit on it, rule everything. But he didn't move, because he understood something most rulers never did. Power taken by force always demands more blood. Behind him, Talisa's voice came softly. "It's yours." Robb shook his head. "No," he said. He turned away from it. "It never was." And with that, Robb Stark did something no king before him had ever done. He walked away, not from responsibility, but from the kind of power that destroys everything it touches. In the years that followed, the story would spread across Westeros, not as a tale of conquest, but as something rarer. A king who survived betrayal, a war that didn't end in ashes, a man who chose peace when he had every reason not to, and people would remember his name, not just as the young wolf, but as the king who ended Lannister rule and refused to become the next tyrant.